Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating. We're going to look at how a tiny, fiercely independent record label completely re-engineered the cultural DNA of a deeply divided British nation. By perfectly mashing up the syncopated, upbeat rhythms of Jamaican ska with the raw DIY ethos of punk rock and packaging the whole thing with just brilliant graphic design, this movement proved that a highly localized subculture could literally hijack the mainstream pop charts. Okay, let's dive into this. To really get this phenomenon, we have to look at a pretty stark contrast. Back in 1979, the British motor city of Coventry was, well, it was rusting. The post-war economic boom had totally collapsed, and the whole narrative of the era was basically dominated by division, industrial decay, and this deep generational despair. But out of this gray, honestly bleak environment came two-tone records. It was an absolute explosion of stark black and white that stood firmly for unity. And maybe the craziest part of this whole shebang, 700 pounds. I mean, think about that. That incredibly small initial investment was literally all it took to launch a movement that completely bypassed traditional industry gatekeepers and dominated national trends. So let's look at exactly how the stage was set for this to happen. Section 1. The Concrete Canvas. Coventry in the late 1970s. So, to really grasp the foundation of the two-tone label, we've got to understand the unique environment it was born into. Coventry had previously been this booming hub for automotive manufacturing after World War II, which brought in a diverse workforce, including a massive influx of immigrants from the Caribbean. But, by the late 70s, the socioeconomic depression was just severe. Factories were shutting their doors everywhere. Youth unemployment was rocketing toward 20%. And on top of all this economic hardship, far-right groups like the National Front were actively recruiting disenfranchised youth right out there on those bleak, concrete street corners. It was a severely divided city. But here's the thing. The traditional music industry down in London was largely ignoring what was happening up in the Midlands. Down in Coventry's underground network of youth clubs, pubs, and blues dances, this incredible cross-cultural synthesis was taking place. You had white working-class kids who grew up on glam and punk, mixing with first-generation Black British youth raised on reggae, rocksteady, and ska. They were sharing the exact same dance floors, blending that frantic punk energy with Jamaican rhythms. And they were realizing that, despite the heavy division outside those doors, their economic frustrations were absolutely identical. They just needed a spark. Section 2. Building an English Motown. Jerry Dammer's vision. Enter Jerry Dammers. He was an art student and keyboardist with a vision that went way, way beyond just forming a band. He saw that the raw energy of punk was kind of burning itself out, almost becoming a bit of a caricature of itself. But the older, upbeat 1960s Jamaican ska, that offered a highly danceable alternative that could still carry a really heavy socio-political message. So Dammers formed a multiracial band called The Specials, but more importantly, he wanted an entire structural institution, an English Motown, if you will, an independent infrastructure totally inspired by Berry Gordy's Detroit Empire, built to house a multiracial ska revival. So how did he actually pull this off? Well, he followed 3 distinct steps to bypass the major London gatekeepers entirely. First, he borrowed that initial 700 pounds we talked about earlier. Second, he pressed 5,000 copies of a split single. And third, he stamped it with a brand new label of his own creation, Two Tone Records. The A-side was his band's track Gangsters, and the B-side was The Selector, which was actually just an instrumental by a then unformed local group. Section 3, the black and white brand, the visual lexicon. Pressing a record is, really only half the battle. What makes this a true masterclass for creators today is the strict, totally immaculate graphic design that came next. Dammers understood fundamentally that a subculture requires a uniform. He brilliantly combined the sharp, tailored look of 1960s mod culture with the Jamaican rude boy aesthetic. We are talking pork pie hats, Fred Perry polo shirts, sharp black suits paired with thin black ties, and those crisp white socks popping against black loafers. It was the strict aesthetic discipline that provided instant, undeniable brand recognition way before modern SEO or digital marketing even existed. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the centerpiece of this branding, the label's logo, known as Walt Jabsco. It's a striking, high-contrast illustration based on an old photo of Peter Tosh. When you combine that with their relentless black and white checkerboard motif, it was a literal, physical manifestation of the label's core philosophy of racial unity. In a messy, chaotic late 70s record store bin, a two-tone sleeve jumped right out at you. It basically acted as physical click-through rate logic. You just couldn't ignore it. Section 4, Sonic Synthesis and Domination. Hijacking the charts. And this brilliantly illustrates the commercial blitzkrieg that followed. With the sound and the visual brand totally locked in, that first independent single, Gangsters, rocketed up the national charts in 1979, peaking at number 6. The London music industries was immediately forced to pay attention to Coventry. Dammers quickly signed a distribution deal with Chrysalis Records, but crucially, he maintained total creative and aesthetic control. The result? A massive chart takeover. Act after act transformed an underground subculture into a national pop phenomenon in mere months. You had Madness peaking at 16 with The Prince, The Selector hitting number 8, right up to The Specials eventually soaring all the way to number 1 with Ghost Town. The true genius here was the curation. It wasn't just a vehicle for the specials, it was a carefully curated exhibition of a movement. You had The Selector, fronted by Pauline Black, blending reggae with fierce political lyricism. You had Madness, a North London ska punk outfit. The Beat from Birmingham, whose lineup actually included older Jamaican saxophonist Saxa, which brought this incredible cross-generational legitimacy. And you had the Bodysnatchers, an all-female ska band, proving two-tone wasn't just breaking racial barriers, but they were smashing the heavily male-dominated landscape of rock and reggae too. Section 5. The Ghost Town Apex. Summer of 1981. All this incredible momentum led to the commercial and cultural apex of the label, which arrived during a highly volatile period. The backdrop of the summer of 1981 was one of severe national unrest in Britain. Economic shifts had really decimated industrial centers, and racial profiling by police had ignited riots in places like Brixton and Toxteth. In this intensely difficult climate, the Specials released a song called Ghost Town. It totally abandoned their usual upbeat ska frenzy for an eerie, haunting, dub-heavy reggae crawl. It painted a devastating portrait of urban decay and perfectly mirrored the socio-political reality of the era. And remarkably, Ghost Town spent 3 entire weeks at number 1 on the UK singles chart. It was this chilling alignment of pop music and reality, marking one of the most culturally significant chart toppers in British history. Commercial music was directly reflecting a deeply fractured society. Section 6. An enduring blueprint. The label's legacy. Now, like all explosive youth movements, that intense, white-hot pressure was ultimately unsustainable. The sudden fame, the internal friction, those grueling tour schedules, it fractured the bands. In fact, the Specials actually split up in the dressing room of Top of the Pops right after performing Ghost Town. So, the crucial point is this. Even though the initial ska revival burned out almost as quickly as it ignited, the legacy of two-tone is just immense. They proved that an independent, artist-led imprint could dictate national trends. They provided a soundtrack for anti-racism during one of Britain's most divided eras. And they laid down an exact blueprint for independent marketing that legendary labels like Factory, Creation, and Rough Trade would follow for decades. They proved once and for all that pop music could be fiercely political, visually flawless, and commercially dominant all at the exact same time. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question today. We've seen how two-tone managed to completely bypass major gatekeepers by leveraging a highly specific visual aesthetic and tapping into a localized subculture. So, looking at your own work, how can modern digital creators apply Jerry Dammer's English Motown philosophy to stand out and build a real, tangible community in today's algorithmic landscape? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.